Our fellow teacher, Dr. Morgan Nolte, is with us today to talk about how to lower insulin resistance naturally. Morgan is a board certified clinical specialist in geriatric physical therapy. Welcome to Avaya, Morgan.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great to have you. And this is such an important topic as it relates to the conversation of menopause, since it tends to be an issue as we go through the journey. So why don't we start with what is insulin resistance for people who don't know?
Yeah, so insulin resistance is a condition that takes decades to develop typically, unless you're having very high amounts of fructose, you can develop it quickly. But what happens is over time, when you live a lifestyle that keeps insulin elevated, and insulin is the hormone produced by your pancreas, that's primary job is to keep blood sugars low. So when you live a lifestyle that keeps insulin up and really demands a lot of your pancreas, such as eating a diet high in processed foods, eating a diet high in sugar, eating frequently throughout the day or having a lot of mini meals, physical inactivity, chronic stress, sleep deprivation, and then toxin exposure. Those are the main things that will raise insulin. Over time, your cells get resistant to the effect of insulin, meaning more is needed to get the same job done of keeping stable blood sugars. So research has shown that insulin can actually predict type 2 diabetes up to 2 decades, like 10, 15, 20 years before glucose. So this is a really important topic from a disease prevention standpoint, because many people think they're healthy just because they have normal fasting glucose, normal A1C, which is a 3-month average of your glucose. But in the background, they could have rising levels of insulin resistance for decades and not really realize that there's this underlying condition going on that's increasing their risk for all of those conditions that you mentioned in the intro. So that's insulin resistance, and it can happen in different cells of the body. So it can happen in your muscle cells, your fat cells, your liver cells, your brain cells, the cells of your joints. So there is no body system that is not affected by insulin resistance. And that's really why we see it linked to so many different diseases.
And what would you say the major causes are? You mentioned a few things like lifestyle habits that could create insulin resistance. Can you go a little bit deeper into the causes?
Yeah, so the major causes, as I mentioned, would be related to diet. So a diet that frequently raises blood sugar levels will cause a direct rise in insulin. Again, because insulin's job is to control blood sugar. So the higher your blood sugar, the higher your blood insulin will need to be, because high blood sugars are very inflammatory to your body. Your body doesn't like change. It likes homeostasis. It likes that tight balance. So that's why your blood sugars typically range between 70 and 100, on any given day if you're healthy. So a cause of that, if we break down nutrition a little bit more, if you think of it, there's 4 macronutrients. There's water, carbohydrates, proteins, and dietary fats. Under the carbohydrates umbrella, there's starches, there's sugars, and there's fiber. And so the types of carbohydrates that will really spike insulin and lead to insulin resistance over time are what we call the naked carbohydrates. So they don't have any fiber, protein, or fat left. They've been processed and stripped of those nutrients. So if you think of things like if it has a bag, a box, a barcode, all of those processed foods, chips, candy, cookies, cake, ice cream, a lot of those just sugar. So sugar is the primary nutrient that contributes the most to insulin resistance. Breaking that down even more is fructose. So the simple sugar called fructose is the one that contributes the most to insulin resistance, just because the liver is the primary site of fructose metabolism. So unlike glucose, which is a different type of simple sugar that can be used anywhere in the body by any cell in your body, so you have a very high capacity to metabolize and utilize glucose. Fructose is specific to the liver. So when we're eating high doses of added sugar, which is 50% glucose, 50% fructose, or things like high fructose corn syrup, which has a lot of fructose, or even natural sweeteners like honey and agave, which have more fructose than table sugar, we're really taxing our liver. And what happens then is liver fat is created. So fructose is the single driver of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And in fact, alcohol itself isn't really the cause of fatty liver disease. It's the fructose produced by the alcohol metabolism. So that's a really interesting fact, is that link between the non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and the alcoholic fatty liver disease are both driven by fructose. So when we're talking about causes of insulin resistance, added sugar is a big one. Another one from a dietary standpoint would be the refined seed and vegetable oils. So things like canola oil, safflower oil, soybean oil, corn oil. There's a few other ones in there, but those can actually be very inflammatory. So what's interesting is anything that is inflammatory to your body can also be a contributor to insulin resistance, because they feed off of each other. High insulin levels are inflammatory, and inflammation raises insulin. So that's really why we focus on a low insulin and inflammation lifestyle. So from a dietary standpoint, those are two things. The other thing that's really important to consider is being sure you're eating enough protein and enough fiber. So we know that a reduction in skeletal muscle mass will contribute to insulin resistance, because I like to describe muscle as the garage where your glucose goes. So when you have a meal that's high in starch, that's high in sugar, you're going to be able to tolerate that better if you have somewhere to put it besides fat tissue. So the more muscle mass you have, the more you can replenish your muscle glycogen stores before you create new fat tissue. And so that's really important just from an insulin standpoint, to have more insulin sensitivity. But also as a geriatric PT, I saw sarcopenia and falls and fractures all the time. So we know that we need healthy muscle mass to age well and to function well as we age. So another big cause dovetailing on that is a lack of resistance training. So when I say physical inactivity, I don't just mean general walking around, maybe walking on the treadmill or running at a light level. We need to be strengthening our muscles. Our muscles are an organ, and they need to be treated and taken care of as such. So in order to really care for those muscles, resistance training is needed at a high enough intensity to actually make a difference. So if you're just curling dumbbells, doing overhead shoulder presses with 3 pounds, you can do them 30 times. You're not working hard enough to strengthen your muscles. So we need that adequate protein dose and resistance training together to build healthy muscle mass and improve insulin sensitivity. Another cause, as I mentioned, is stress. And in tandem with that really is chronic sleep deprivation. So sleep deprivation is a form of stress on your body. And what happens here is you have elevated cortisol levels, and we'll talk about why this is especially important in menopause here. So your cortisol is produced in your adrenal glands, which sit on top of your kidneys. Now, cortisol is just a hormone. It doesn't have any calories. It doesn't have any carbohydrates. But what happens when cortisol is released is your body goes in fight or flight mode. And what then happens is blood sugar is released into your bloodstream so that your muscles can have energy to fight or flee a situation. But most of our stress these days is emotional, mental stress. So we don't need to fight or flee. So what happens then is, because your muscles aren't demanding the glucose stays in your bloodstream, and then insulin has to be released to push that glucose in, to store it again. So a rise in cortisol will raise your glucose, which will raise your insulin. Many women who are struggling to lose weight will just diet more and they'll exercise more, and they'll refuse to address the underlying issue of stress management and boundaries and healthy communication and healthy relationships and all of that stuff that goes into a healthy lifestyle must be addressed for sustainable weight loss. And why stress is mostly very important around menopause is because as your estrogen declines, so does your insulin sensitivity. So estrogen is a insulin sensitizing hormone, so protective against insulin resistance. As estrogen goes down, well, your ovaries aren't producing the estrogen anymore, but estrogen is a very important hormone, not just for your reproductive health, but for your cognition, your muscle health, your bone health, everything. So estrogen needs to be produced still. And so the fat tissue and the adrenal glands pick up the slack. So now the adrenal glands are being taxed even more because not only are they having to produce the stress hormones, they're having to produce estrogen. And if you are really stressed out in this season of life, your body is going to be making so much stress hormone that your fat tissue becomes even more valuable real estate, because now that's kind of the sole place, not the sole, but a primary production site of estrogen. So a lot of women who want to lose weight, especially if they're postmenopausal, would be very wise to focus on reducing stress, reducing the amount of adrenaline and cortisol that needs to be produced by the adrenals. So the adrenals can pick up the estrogen demand, and the fat tissue can kind of take a break and say, okay, we don't need you anymore because our adrenals are producing the estrogen. So chronic stress is a big cause of insulin resistance, as is chronic sleep deprivation. I used to say I'll sleep when I'm dead. I don't say that anymore, because aside from the elevated cortisol that can happen, you have elevated levels of ghrelin from sleep deprivation, and ghrelin is your hunger hormone. And interestingly, you have increased carbohydrate cravings. So I forget what the hormone's called specifically, but when you're sleep deprived, notice the next day you're probably going to be craving more carbs and sugar, which, as I just explained, are the nutrients that will spike insulin and blood glucose the most. So good sleep hygiene is a very important part of a healthy lifestyle. Another thing that I think is often overlooked is just water, especially for postmenopausal women. If they have a weak bladder, maybe some prolapse, some incontinence, they're a little bit hesitant to increase their water intake because they don't want to have to pee all the time or get up at night to go to the bathroom. But it's essential that you're drinking at least half your body weight in ounces of water a day, because your fat tissue, when it's broken down, releases water. So we think of fat tissue as an energy storage, but it's also a water storage for your body. And if you're underhydrated, your body, again, is going to want to hold on to that fat because it's going to say, well, where are we going to get our water? She's not drinking enough of it. So nutrition, stress management, resistance training. We really want to optimize the sleep and then reducing our toxin exposure. And I don't talk a ton about this because I think this is a specialty in and of itself. But really being sure that you're getting as clean of equipment and supplies as possible. Makeup, cleaners, cookware, drinkware, all of those things can add to your cellular stress, which can ultimately lead to cellular dysfunction, including insulin resistance. So those would be the main causes of insulin resistance. And then the one thing that I think is overlooked is medications. So certain medications like birth control, for example, can really raise hsCRP, which is a marker of inflammation. So higher inflammation, higher insulin resistance. Another one are statins, which are very inappropriately prescribed based on total cholesterol or LDL cholesterol alone. I have a lot of content on YouTube that explains the difference between LDL cholesterol and LDL particle number. So if people are like, whoa, what's she talking about with cholesterol here? I'm not going to explain it now. Just go on my YouTube channel and Google LDLP versus LDLC. I explain all of it on there. But statins will increase insulin resistance. So unfortunately, people are taking a medication that can cause, joint pain and muscle fatigue and insulin resistance, and they may not even need to be on it. So I'm always a big advocate of checking your medications to see how those may be impacting blood sugar, insulin, and your weight.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So many amazing things in that whole conversation. And
Avaya has changed my life.
Avaya has made me the woman I am today.
Avaya is my home.
Avaya is personal freedom.
Avaya is the reason my life continuously improves.
Let everyone in your life know about Avaya.
Everyone needs to know about this amazing company.
Thank you, Avaya, for appearing in my inbox.
What Ike Allen and Andy Anderson have created at Avaya is what the world needs.